So, I want to talk about the show, the Showtime Frontline. You went to Israel, you walked on the wall, you went to Palestine, so I'm guessing it was inspired by that experience.
Yeah, the whole thing started in 2009. Well, it's kind of 2009 that I had this idea that I could use the wall, the Israeli wall in the West Bank, as a route map. That actually all military walls are kind of, they're admissions of failure. So when you see a military wall like that, politics has failed. Whether it's the wall of China, whether it's Hadrian's Wall, whatever wall it is, whether it's a Berlin Wall, there's a massive wall in Western Sahara. Actually, it's the biggest wall going, because Western Sahara was occupied by Morocco in '74. So you have a wall going down the side of Morocco and Algeria, and then down the side of Western Sahara and cutting across to the sea. So you have these walls are just admissions of massive failure, and what they're destined to become are tourist attractions. Do you know what I mean? That's what they become. And so there's a kind of like slightly cheeky provocation that I'm going to walk your wall before the tourists get to it.
So you're the first tourist in a way.
It was. Yeah. I'm here before the gift shops arrive.
But it's also like a fascination between, like there's one culture there and a different culture on the other side. Or are they a lot more similar than you think?
They're both. There is... The actual friends of mine, I work with this wonderful Israeli fixer who's a journalist, and she's great, and she's pretty hardcore, and she arranged Jerry Adams to do filming in a checkpoint on Easter Sunday. So it's kind of like, she's really cool, and she would often say, "We deserve each other. Palestinians and Israelis, we deserve each other," and she talks about how similar they are. And actually, for me, it's very interesting. So you have those similarities, but there's also societal inequities, which are huge, and they appear at all levels. So literally, if you blindfolded me and put me in a car and drove me on the Israeli side of the wall, and then blindfolded me and drove me on the Palestinian, I would be able to tell you which side we were on, just from the suspension. So, do you know what I mean? The differences are all around you. What was fascinating was to walk this route, and we just had look, I'll be honest with you, if somebody said to me, "Will you do it again?" I'd go, "Yeah, but I'd be a lot more careful," because I didn't realise how stupid I was being.
It's actually quite... I mean, I would imagine it's quite dangerous off the top of my head, but I have no idea.
It's the randomness of the danger that actually, like at one point, like we would get picked up by the Israelis quite quickly, quite sort of regularly, because if you walk near the wall, why? You hear what's going on, why have you got a camera, they're filming us, they're against us, da-da-da. So that would happen on a quite regular basis. Sometimes I'd get cross about it, and sometimes you'd just go, "Oh God, come on, let's sit down," and you'd wait for an hour or 2 hours for all the passports to be checked and stuff. Other times you would get, we would get arrested, and it was like, "Oh my God, we're going to be deported," and there was a couple of moments where we just made some really stupid errors out of tiredness. Where what happens is the wall is a massive concrete entity, but it's also a military series of barriers. So in the countryside, you'll have a pyramid of coiled barbed wire, so 3 rows like a pyramid. Then you'll have a gap, then you'll have a trench, then you'll have a sand path, and the sand path is just to show if anyone's walked near the fence. And so then you have a fence which is covered in motion detectors and barbed wire. Then on the other side of that, you've got another sand path. And next to that, you've got a military road, which is patrolled 24 hours a day. And then you've got all the watchtowers and the military patrols. Then you've got another trench. Then you've got another coil of barbed wire. And so you have these whole sort of military installations there. And once we just, out of tiredness and exasperation, we were stuck. It was raining. We were exhausted. And we saw a hole in the barbed wire. And we just went, "Let's just go through." And we were with an ex-Israeli soldier, and he led us through. And so we were walking on the military road, sort of. And as soon as we got there, I just thought, "This is wrong. We've just made a mistake. We've made a huge mistake." And within 10 minutes, we were picked up by the Israeli army and put into jeeps and gunpoint and all of this and driven off. And
so
actually,
at least you weren't shot.
No, we weren't sure. That was a relief.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like we're going to get deported. And actually, our brilliant Israeli fixer got us out of trouble. And I said, "What did you do?" And she said, "I phoned them up and said, you've got these idiots. Now, I work with these idiots. I have to work with these idiots. And as far as I'm concerned, you can throw away the key. But I'm going to have to deal with it, and you're going to have to deal with it. And it's Friday. And maybe we should just enjoy the weekend. Why don't we just let them go?"
Oh, very clever. Very
and
clever.
So that's what happened. On another occasion, we were actually stoned by Palestinians. We were walking in a gully. So you have the wall like this, and then there's a little gully, and then a hillside that goes up. And we were walking with an ex-Israeli soldier and an ex-Palestinian freedom fighter. So we're walking along, and suddenly the stones just come in, and they're huge, great rocks. Unfortunately, the ex-soldier just went, "Don't run! Just watch where the stones are coming from." And that's what you do. You get 4 seconds grace to work out where they're coming from.
So why not run? Does that make it?
Because if you run, you'll get hit.
Oh,
you
I see.
won't
Because
see
you
where the
can't see.
stones.
Yeah,
can't
you
see
haven't
where
got
the
4
stones are coming.
seconds. Yeah.
You're right. If you're looking at where the stones are coming, you can dodge and move slowly out the way. Just keep watching at what's coming at you. But if you run, you're gonna get hit.
So there's a lot of suspicion on both sides about anybody going along the wall.
Yeah. And well, although the Palestinian side, I should say, are just hugely friendly. And actually...
You talked about this in the show.
Yeah, demonstrably friendly. They'll just bring you in and they'll feed you. And
did you put 5 kilos or something on the on a 3-month walk?
On weight on this walk. It was just incredible. We actually used to call coffee the Palestinian roadblock. When people go, "Come, you must have coffee. You must come to..." Oh, we're stuck. And that was it.
And were they curious about what you were doing on the
people
Palestinian
were.
side?
People were very curious about what we're doing. But people have an opinion about it as well. Because... like there's lots and lots of activists and NGOs that go over to Palestine, and some people would say to me, "So what are you going to do at the end of this?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm going to write a book." And they say, "So you're going to make money out of this?" I'm like, well, kind of, but not. Yeah, it's sort of, and there was very much a judgment
because they've been let down by so many
not just
people,
let down, but used.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of NGOs go into places like Palestine, and they have their own agendas, they have their own itinerary, they have their remits, and you have to fill in all the forms, you have to tick the boxes and everything. So when we're in our show, Faisal and Allah, who are 2 Palestinian performers, they talk about what it's like to be in a refugee camp when there was actually a German charity that came along and got really upset. They were going to do a project with them, and they got really upset because they had an iPhone. And actually, for them, that was kind of like, you've got an iPhone.
Oh, the noble, savage kind of mentality.
You shouldn't have an iPhone. You should be running around looking like a proper refugee. And so they withdrew the funding because they had an iPhone.
Oh, really?
And it's just like, and that kind of attitude that says, we were determined when we did our show that what I wouldn't not do is tell them what to say. Right? I'm not going to be the filter for anything. Right, I'm not the NGO, I'm not the monitor of language, I'm not the monitor of ideas here. What's important is you hear their voices and you hear their experience, the lived experience that they have. And that was really, really important to us when we made the show. So I've kind of flipped ahead. So if I nip back...
Well, just before we nip back again, that's one of the things I really loved about the show, because it presented a very different experience of Palestine. For somebody watching it, because normally it's like, the war, this and this, but it was day-to-day experiences, some of them are quite mundane, and the mundanity of life is quite fascinating.
Well, I think it's also, there's a thing about, when I first, what I did was at the end of Walking the Wall, right, which was something which I adored doing. And it was one of those experiences that you have and you just think, that's changed my life. And I always wanted to go back and work with the Jenin Freedom Theatre. Now, Jenin Freedom Theatre is in the north of Palestine. It's the home of the Second Intifada. It's where everything kind of kicked off. It's very rebellious, but it's also very religiously conservative. There's big expectations to be fighters, big expectations to be, decent and adhere to sort of certain moral Muslim values, societal values. And it was really interesting to go and find this theatre in the middle of a refugee camp. And I love that. And I love the fact that there's a theatre in a refugee camp, because it challenges people's preconceptions. because what it talks about is our desire to create, our desire to make things, our desire to be bigger than the situation that we've born from, to escape from whatever situation that we've been born into, and to create our own lives, which is stunning. I love that. And so when I discovered this, discovered it like Christopher Columbus discovered America. When I found out about this theatre, I was like, wow, this is just the most exciting thing. And the guys there were just thrilling, right? In the middle of a refugee camp, and the refugee camp, there's 17,000 people, it's really crammed, you've got loads of alleyways, and the buildings are already smashed up together, and it's really run down, and you go in there, and there's this theatre in there. And there's drama classes going in, and there are women on stage, and they're the most eloquent spokespeople. Just absolutely eloquent. I remember talking to the guy who ran it, a guy called Juliana Mechamis. He's half Israeli, half Palestinian, murdered in 2011 outside the theatre. He is amazing guy, and he was captivating. He was so charismatic. It was just incredible. And he talked about, training people for a cultural intifada, for actually what you would do is you would challenge everyone's preconceptions. And he was great. He was thrilling to just be near. And he had the women on the course, because this is quite a taboo subject, to not just have men and women in the same room, but to have women performing. And he was telling me about one of the women in the class who I met. She was from outside the camp. From the refugee camp. There were leaflets put round saying she was a slut because she was on stage and da-la-da-la-da. And what had to happen was her family had to walk her through the refugee camp to get to the theatre to attend the theatre
Because
class.
people try to stop her.
Yeah.
Going.
And so there were occasions when her family had fistfights in the street to get their daughter to do a drama course.
Wow.
And I was like, this is incredible. So I was just...
So what was your reaction with you going in there then, initially? The first time you went to that place?
Oh, well, I loved it. And it was just like, it was one of those great moments where you just felt... And I remember we had a cameraman with us called Phil, who's a lovely, lovely fella, and still talks to me. And we did the whole walk together, and we remembered that being at the Jenin Freedom Theatre, they said to us, why don't you stay here? We've got a guest flat for performers. Why don't you just stay here? And it was one of these great sort of guest flats, and we just sort of... They said to us, there's one small problem, which is if you're having a shower and you turn on the light, the cold water will just go on automatically. You won't get any warm. And I was like, OK, do you see any problem with the connection of electricity and water? Do you see any... is there anything here? But it was a great place. And what you felt was, I remember saying to Phil, this is the first place where I feel at home. And we felt that we were so welcomed there, and it felt like our gang. Do you know what I mean? This creative, weird little sort of outlaw gang.
What's the reaction outside the theatre to you being there? Was there any kind of reaction?
Well, people know. Jenin's a city, but it just gossips like mad, and so everyone knew we were there. Mm-hmm. And whenever I go and visit, word gets round, and I get texts from my mates who live miles out of Jenin. All of a sudden they go, I hear you're coming. And it's that kind of place.
So it's quite a positive reaction.
I'd say it was mixed. I think the people in the theatre was kind of cautious of...
You had that in the play. Well, it is actually a play. We'll get to that later. But you had the old men judging the competition. It's quite interesting. A bit like the Muppet Theatre.
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
And the things they're saying, it's really funny, but it's an interesting look at... it's the piece you're doing is looking at lots of different not targets necessarily, but it's making lots of comments about things. And it's not a Palestinian situation, it's actually the Palestinians' own situation with themselves as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is what I love about the show, is when I went back and thought, OK, what I want to do is to try and run a comedy course here. And for me, what was really important was that we actually gave something. That it's not about us getting this experience and then going home, but it's about them having the experience. And so we spent a lot of time talking to the theatre and to people who ran things about what we would be doing and what value we would bring to the place, and whether people wanted it. Do you know what I mean? We saw NGO workers out there who had said, well, we've come over here and I was going to do this, but no one's turned up. And it's like, well, maybe you should have asked them if they wanted that, And what we did once we ran this course and had this experience of trying to put on a comedy club in a refugee camp, bringing over Faisal and Allah, my two co-performers, I wanted their voices to be centre stage. And what I wanted to hear was their authentic voice. to hear because they're furious at the Palestinian Authority, who they regard as corrupt, and they regard as being a puppet government. And when they go on demonstrations against the wall or against Israeli occupation, it's the Palestinian police who are policing it because they've been hired by the Israeli authorities. They're furious about that, about the indignity, just the awfulness of the humiliation of having to endure that. They're furious at the fact that actually, it's a joke for them.
Quite literally.
It is It is a joke that they've got this puppet government that really is, that pretends to have the trappings of state and has nothing. For them, they are furious about that. But they're also kind of like, they're trying to be creative people. So they're trying to break out of the societal conservatism, the religious conservatism, the expectation of the binary vision that if you're a Palestinian, then you'll be a freedom fighter or you'll be a victim. That's it. So, when we went there and first started to work, Allah came up to me and just said, so what's your show about then? What are you going to do if you go over to London and do this? And I said, well, what I want to show is that people have this vision of Palestinians as victims or terrorists, and actually they're everything in between. And God bless him, Allah just went, I am with you. It was just great. It was just brilliant.
And that, to me, that's the crux of what's so fascinating about the piece. Yes, it's funny, but it's actually quite, like I said before, it's an interesting insight into a culture you don't really know a lot about when you live over here. You just get the news images, the TV images, and like you say, terrorist or victim. And it was great to see all the different little shades in between. Like they're laughing at themselves, they're laughing at their own culture, they're laughing at the Israeli culture, they're laughing at the international situation, and then just day-to-day stuff in between.
Yeah, I love the fact that Seja, who's this young woman who appears, we show footage of her, and she was one of the... I particularly loved her because she was 26-year-old and she works, unmarried, lives... And actually, I remember somebody telling me, saying, oh, it's very sad about her. I said, what do you mean? He said, not married. I said... 26? Yeah, here on the shelf. I was like, you're kidding. What's that about? But that's actually a genuine thing. And I love the fact that here's this unmarried 26-year-old woman who manages a hostel, and she has got such a unique voice. And it's her own voice. And it comes through very clearly. And all the little snippets that we show of her, those are her words. So we've used her lists, her ideas, and her words. So actually you get the sense of who she really is and her individuality. She's got this amazing... She would do these routines that were so exciting. Or the other students, you'd quite often get cliques and little gangs and, and people, the way that people do, and students. And... everyone shut up for her. Everyone would come and watch.
Because she had the thing, the charisma thing.
She was genius. And I love the fact that what she talks about is maybe a little bit about the occupation, maybe a bit about her father, maybe a bit about the culture that says you can't date boys, but it'll also be about choosing a scarf and getting ice cream. You know what I mean? And Korean
stuff that
pop
weirdly
music.
is actually more important in the end to people in day-to-day.
Yeah,
the trivia.
The really interesting thing, I think, is people sometimes come along to the show expecting it to be about the Israeli occupation, and it's not. It's about Palestinian lives under an occupation, which are two different things.
Which is what I totally loved about it. Yeah. And the comedy, did it translate internationally? I was quite interested when you said you set up, you're doing the play thing, yes, and you talk about setting up the comedy course in Palestine. I was wondering, how did you do that, because you're very British in a sense. Yeah. And how does it translate? Do people understand comedy wherever you go around the world? Or?
I think there's a really interesting thing, which is stand-up has become such a dominant cultural form that it's recognisable in all sorts of different cultures. So there are Palestinian comics who live in Israel and who perform, and there are American Palestinian comics who will talk about going back. And actually, you get on the internet and you can find all sorts of comics. And you look at someone like Bassem Youssef, who used to have this TV show on. It was kind of like the Jon Stewart Daily Show, in Egypt. And I'd recommend that everyone go and check him out. Bassem Youssef. There's a documentary about his work, which is just stunning. He took the piss out of Morsi, who won the election, and he would appear in this. There's a famous sketch that he does about Morse's hat, where they have this huge hat that's lowered in front of a studio audience, and he sings this song to the tune of Copacabana. His name was Morsi, and it was it was a real funny thing. It just ripped the whole lot apart. But when Bassem Youssef and Jon Stewart went to, as you know, they're very close, actually, Stewart and Bassem Youssef, and Stewart really holds him in huge esteem, because here's a man who genuinely challenges power. Is a genuine satirist in the way. In a dangerous situation. And Bassem Youssef fled Egypt after telling jokes about the Egyptian military and after the takeover. And you know, it's so the form of stand-up, the form of satire is out there.
But is it the content or the delivery that makes it funny?
Both.
Yeah. I mean, you can get a joke made in another country about somebody you never even heard of, maybe.
Well, there's a great gag. I think there's a wonderful example of this. There's a brilliant play which I showed the guys when we started, which is by Trevor Griffiths, who is one of the great northern working class playwrights working in television. The most amazing writer. He also wrote Reds with Warren Beatty, and he did a play called Comedians, and this was just before the explosion of alternative comedy, and it was about a night class for comics in a northern working class adult education sort of setup, and this guy comes in and there's an amazing sort of deconstruction of comedy that takes place, and at one point a guy comes in and he's an Asian man, he's just come to the wrong room. It's an adult education thing. He's just come to the wrong room. And the teacher goes, I'll go and find someone. And he tells a gag. He said, there's a joke that's very popular in my country. And I'm paraphrasing wildly. And the joke is, a guy is starving to death in India. His family are starving. And every day he looks out and he sees the sacred cow. And he thinks, can I kill the sacred cow? No, I can't kill the sacred cow. Can I kill the sacred cow? Can't kill the sacred cow. And his family are getting thinner and thinner, and they're getting more and more desperate. And one day he walks out, and he's got a massive machete, and he walks up to the sacred cow, and he lifts up the blade, and the sacred cow turns and says, what are you doing? You're killing me. I'm a sacred cow. And the man turns to his children and says, come and see the talking horse before we eat. Which is a great gag. And I love that idea. But actually, in the show, they show people just not getting it because there's no cultural... There was a cultural divide. But actually, I think there is. I think actually, the thing about it is, that when you see people tell gags that you recognise as gags, you also see the differences in us as well as the similarities. So when you see Allah talking about a PA man turning up at a wedding with fake money, do you know what I mean? And they have bodyguards at some Palestinian weddings who will stand there next to the groom when they get the money, and they do have checks to see the money isn't fake. Do you know what I mean? So when he tells these stories, you actually get this little insight into a world that you might not have seen. When when Raneen, who's another character in the show, she talks about how she's really glad and happy to get through the Israeli checkpoint, and then suddenly there's a Palestinian checkpoint, you know. And actually, you're into this world which opens up and shows you something you might not have seen before.
I mean, were you conscious of all this when you started the course, teaching the course? I mean, would you have to understand their reference points, the rhythm of their comedy, the way they tell the jokes?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, I was working with this brilliant woman called Dr. Sam Beale, who teaches the stand-up course at Middlesex Uni, and she's great. Old mate of mine, known each other for ages. She used to be involved in Squall, which is an old anarchist sheet. I don't know if you remember them, they were great. And she's just great, she's brilliant. And she's really, really good at teaching stand-up. And so I approached her and said, would you come and do this with me? And so I devised this workshop around the ideas that she teaches, which are about having fun, looking at your own life, how you take things from your own life and your own surroundings and are silly with it, but how you approach things in different attitude, about timing, about playfulness, about expectation, about all these kind of things that are used in stand-up. And what was brilliant about it was the course that Sam sort of worked on translates, and it translates because people just, you know, there are... if you start going, this is how you clown, this is how you misbehave, then they go, OK, we're up for this. We insisted that everyone worked in whatever language they were happy with. So there'll be some would be performing in Arabic from day one, others would be performing in English. In the last 10 days, everyone had to perform in Arabic because that's the language they would be performing in. So we had translators with us from day one, but we also encouraged a group idea that you would critique each other as a group and you'd be able to do that. So actually, they would take over from our job. We made sure that there were teachers from the Janine Freedom Theatre doing the course, so when we leave, all that stuff is still there. Do you know what I mean? So they've got the techniques and the ideas. And that was really important to us, that there were women on the course and that the teachers came and did it, because we wanted that information to stay there. And what's really exciting is when you're working with a group who are critiquing each other, and they explain things for you. Go, no, you don't understand. This is a really big deal, right? Or there'll be. I remember one guy, because there's so many stories we kind of left behind. There was one guy who talked about how he talks about how his family are, and his brother just eating everything, but his dad being a dictator, and it's something you can relate to. But he talks about Ramadan and just all the kids having to wait, and his dad being this dictator at the table with the uncles and all of this. And then, bang, the kids go, and his brother, whoomph, everything just goes. And actually, it's something that is just, there's a minor cultural hurdle you have to jump, and otherwise than that, you're in everyone else's family. Do you know what I mean? So there's lots and lots of similarities, but there are cultural differences, there's language differences that we had to work with. And sometimes there would be gags that would work beautifully in Arabic. Like Faisal talks about makloubi, makloubi being a Palestinian dish, but literally translated it means upside down. So there's a word play. When he says the word makloubi becomes the code word for sex, very quickly an Arab audience get that and understand it. And it's very funny, because when you get Arabs in the audience, especially Palestinians in the audience, you get two timings of laughter. So you'll get people laughing. And Faisal will often say to the audience, if you're white in the audience, don't worry, you'll catch up with the Arabs in a minute. Do you know what I mean?
So he gets 3 jokes out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, how much did you learn from doing the course there as well for your comedy?
Well,
I think, if anything.
Well, no, I did learn a lot. Because actually you have to learn a lot about working with people. And because as a stand-up, it's quite solitary. Stand-ups become very self-critical, they become very solitary creatures. And I've always felt this urge to break out of that. That actually, if you break down the economics of it, right? Stand-up exists in the current form it exists because of economics. Because Thatcher cut the arts councils and the grants and all that kind of stuff, because money left the cooperative and collective way of creating art, which was you'd have a company, you'd have directors and writers and producers, and you'd have all these people who had this interest of vision of trying to get this thing to work. You cut that collective funding, and suddenly you're left with a very corporate model of funding, right? Or you strip it down and you get a microphone and you get one person and a beer that is very happy to be sold at the bar, right? And that's what you've got, an economic model. Actually, most comics are Thatcherites, despite the fact that they might rail against that model. That's what they are. So for me, it was really interesting, and I've done this for the past kind of like 10 years, really, to find other ways of getting other voices on stage. So one show I did, I recorded my mum and dad. So we actually have their voices come on stage. I have conversations with them. Another show was about corporate spying, about BA systems spying on me and my mates who are involved in Campaign Against Arms Trade. And I interviewed them. And so we filmed them. We had these filing cabinets. You pull out the cabinet and there's a TV screen. And I have conversations with them. And I'm always fascinated with how you get other people's voices into what is essentially this solo endeavour. How do you break through? And I completely love, I'm obsessed with sort of all these different art forms. So you get Bertolt Brecht, who is the great German dramatist. He is, my big hero. To the extent that I went to his house when the wall went down, right? When the wall came down, I was there after the wall went down because I thought, I can go and see Bertolt Brecht's house. So I went over to East Germany, before reunification, to go and see Bert Brecht's house. So Brecht, I love. People like Beuys, Joseph Beuys, the great sort of Fluxus artist. All those ideas of how do you involve community, how do you involve, participation, get people involved in something so it's an active form of art. how do you turn it out from spectating into a live thing that's of the moment, that exists only for that moment? Those are the things that completely obsess me. And so the idea of working with other people, that's a continual sort of journey, if you like. And for me to go and suddenly go, okay, I have to now look at what I do, how I work, see if it translates, and take people with me, see if they can perform, see and get through all those little bits of censorship about what people think about, oh, you shouldn't be showing that, women shouldn't be portrayed like that, and then actually get guys back over here. And God bless them, Faisal and Allah, you know, they're people often go, you know, in interviews, it's a little bit embarrassing, people go, you're very brave doing this, and it's like, you're sitting next to the two people who live in this place, and you're telling me I'm brave? Seriously? And actually, they're the brave guys, because I said, will you come and write a play with me? There's no script. We go into a room. If you've had the experience, then the story's inside you. So you go in a room and it'll come out.
They talk about this on the stage. This is postmodernism gone mad, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you actually deconstruct the story of making the story while you're doing it, which is really good, yeah.
And but it means that actually everything happens in the room. There's no kind of... I don't think the audience get a chance to sit back and just spectate. In the first half, you're just kind of... You have to be there with us. Do you know, you have to join in, you have to clap, and you have to click, and you have to make noises, and you have to... And we love that.
Well, I really love that as well. I know last night the bits of music on the laptop broke down.
In the first
I thought that was part of the show. I thought it was amazing because the audience had to sing the bits of music, and I thought, this is total genius.
Well, we just go with what we've got. There's been other points where... Seriously, we just go with whatever happens. At one point, at the end of the first half, me and Faisal are sitting on stage. This is in Edinburgh. Allah goes to walk off stage, and he just goes off in the wrong direction, right? And he is literally heading off stage into a wall. So me and Faisal sit on stage in front of the audience and have to go, Allah, you're going the wrong way. He goes, I know. And then he starts going the right way. Audience start laughing. I turn to Faisal and go, OK, we've got to take a deep breath now because we've got to do a serious scene. I said to the audience, we just excuse us, we've got to recover ourselves. Take a deep breath, look at each other, burst into hysterics. And the moment, because we're in the moment, and it doesn't matter that we've shattered the pretense of this show, because that's all part of it.
And it's before we did this interview, we talk about the great jazz players and this idea, like Mingus, you get the riff, you deconstruct the riff, you go back to the riff. That's kind of a moment in what you're doing there, isn't it?
I love that. I mean, for us, look, we improvise in the show. I think it's quite obvious, and we improvise around a structure. So, and I'm always really important that people work with both things. Right? You can't improvise without a structure. Mingus, I don't know if you probably know this, he was against the free jazz thing. He was like, how can you work from nothing, right? And if you, like people like Mingus, Parker, Roland Kirk, you know, you listen to their improvising and it is beautiful, but they're working from solid standards and solid bands that will give them a platform to bounce for. And they, in turn, provide that platform for the other musicians in the band, you know, which is just outrageously brilliant. And and for me, that's the big joy. Whenever I explain sort of the discipline of structure of work and improvising, I'll always use jazz as the analogy, because that's really, and we love that on the show. The fact that we have fun and play and muck around with each other. It's
like looking at the riff in every single angle possible.
Yeah.
And I mean riff, musical riff, and also a verbal riff or a joke line or whatever. It's looking at the whole 360 and coming back, and then it strengthens it.
I hope, hopefully. But I mean, when you listen to like Mingus, who I adore, you know, and you're captivated by the hook of it, and then the playing, and it just becomes this magical piece of play. And actually, Bert Brecht talks about this. Bertolt Brecht, he was asked to describe. What's great, he's such a contrarian. He was Marquis Smith before Marquis Smith came along, right? Bert Brecht would ask, who influenced your writing? And he says, the Bible. So there you go. And then he says, someone said, what do you think the most important aspect of theatre is? And he said, spas, which is creative play. And actually, those are the two things for me. The absolute rigour and discipline of the commandments and creative play put together. And for me, you can hear that with good jazz.
You're not really a stand-up, are you?
No, not anymore.
You're theatrical.
Yeah, I'm an entity now.
And even from the start, though, even when you're doing stuff in the stand-up idiom, it was a theatrical things were theatrical pieces. They were set up to create situations.
Yeah.
It was so much more. It was bigger. It was wider, wasn't it?
Well, the lovely thing I think about this show is that we've smuggled a piece of theatre onto the stage. That's how we describe it. That it's a play, and we've used all the components that you might not expect a play to be. So we've used reportage, we've used storytelling, we've used stand-up, we've used scenes, we've used deconstructing of scenes, we've used just characters and little vignettes to create a story that people go along. And when you finally see the people who are actually being portrayed on stage, on the screen, I think it's quite emotional, actually. You know, that you see the successes. In a way, it's like fame. Do you know what I mean? You see the background that people are fighting to come from and develop who they are, and then you actually see what they become, and that's what Alan Parker did so brilliantly. An incredibly radical film, I believe. And so all these bits create a play, and we took our inspiration from people like 784 Theatre Company, from the Scottish and English groups. There's a great play called The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, which is all about the Scottish Highlands and the clearances, and it's amazing. It takes the form of a ceilidh. And the guy who directed this show and a show I did called Red Shed, he directed The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil. He revived it in Scotland, and it was this incredible success. And everyone, you have to join in. There are little scenes. There's stuff directly to the audience. There's telling facts. There's all sorts of ways in which you play to create a piece of theatre that isn't about, you know, plot and linear narrative and being, you know, in this situation. And actually, we took inspiration from that. We took inspiration from one of the theatres we're working with is the Stratford East Theatre Royal, which is Joan Littlewood's, who you had Oh What a Lovely War. And so there's a show, one of the most radical shows to come out of British theatre, you know, that took the place of a Pierrot show, you know, of kind of like clowns and of a fun fair, and yet an incredible sort of attack upon militarisation about World War I. And for us, those kind of plays were the inspiration as well as all those other bits.
And it's always been like that with you as well. I mean, obviously you know your stand-up, you know about the history of comedy, etc. But was it the theatrical side that fascinated you as well? The way you can actually, the stuff you did in TV had a certain theatrical element as well. You know, a lot of situationism as well, which I always noticed. You create a situation to make people think, which is what situation is. Not pretentious. It's quite simple, really, isn't it? And it wasn't just somebody standing there telling jokes. It's a lot more to it. Yeah,
I mean, I love stand-up. I love stand-up, but it's always been about what you can do, what you can play, how the idea that if you exist to do something just in one room and it doesn't leave the theatre, then that's pointless to me. You know, what we've done is we've created wallpaper. Nice wallpaper, funny wallpaper, but wallpaper. And what I want is people to take ideas and thoughts and feelings out of the room and actually engage in situations and actions outside of the room. And that's, for me, part of the key to it. And so stand-up, there's always been a tension for me doing stand-up. When I actually did do stand-up, that it wasn't enough. That always it wasn't enough. I hate the idea that the thing with stand-up is, if you're good and people like you, they'll come along and go, oh, I like that. Can't wait to see the next show. I hope it's different, but I want it to be the same. So there is that, you know, for me, it's, if you want to be a creative person, then you've got to create different things. You've got to look at the world differently. You've got to look at each show differently. You've got to look at what you're creating differently. And you've got to try and actually do something that's different all the time. Why would you want to go back and do what you were doing? You know, that great Mark E. Smith line, are you still doing the same job you did 5 years ago? You know, it's that kind of, you just want to go, no, I don't want to do that.
Speaking of which, was a lot of this attitude, this idea that it could be more, you know, was this amplified by growing up through punk rock? You know, the idea of punk rock which probably wasn't necessarily delivered all the time. This idea, it wasn't just music, it wasn't just a singer, it wasn't just a band, there's a whole other thing out there, like a Crass record or whatever.
Oh, it was, we talked about this, about when you buy a Crass record, it's an argument. Because you're buying lyrics, you get the artwork, which is absolutely amazing. You get this each song is an argument. You get the lyric sheet so you can follow it, and actually it was a challenge to the cultural status quo. You know, and I loved The Clash. I was a big fan of The Clash. And then you suddenly get Crass, it was like, oh my God, they're challenging Clash, you know. And they're right. You should do that all the time.
Question everything, which was the punk idiom, wasn't it? Question everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, I remember going to a gig once, and it was a Rock Against Racism gig in Clapham Junction, and me and my mates were there, and somebody gave us a leaflet, and it was this classic, it was almost like Spinal Tap. Someone gave me a leaflet. I was like, Rock Against Sexism. What's that? You know what I mean? And it was this, people having discussions about what it was, what sexism was at the age of 17 at a Rock Against Racism was an amazing thing. Anti-Arts League, amazing things, because they actually pulled people into a movement and made them engage with what was going on.
It affected a lot of people I know in a positive way.
Massively.
Because it's a dangerous time. There's a lot of ideas, good ideas and bad ideas, floating around the ether, weren't there?
Oh, huge. Yeah. But I remember Rock Against Racism, bands like Stiff Little Fingers, actually, who were monumental for me, that actually challenged what you thought and challenged what you held to be just a lazy idea that was just true. And so for me, the idea that you could do it yourself, that you could do your own thing, I love the fact that actually, going to see bands like Brian Brains, remember, who used to be a drummer with Pill, and he created his own little thing, and it's suddenly like you saw this thing going off there, and it was like not what you expected it to be, but you wanted to follow it and find out what was happening. Or the Gang of Four, do you know what I mean? And you just go, what's happening? This is just guitar lines that were just jaw-dropping, the way that guitar was played. And I love the fact that every part of it, not just the form was important, but the way in which the form existed outside of itself was hugely important to me. So you're absolutely right. Punk was sort of like set the template, if you like.
I mean, to me, the thing last night, the closest I could get to it in my head, and this is probably from my own background, was like a Crass record.
A Crass record?
Yeah. Because it's multimedia, it's on so many different levels and things going on.
You've so made the publicity poster.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks. Yeah.